Good evening. I'm Rachel Floor, Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. On behalf of all of my Library and Foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching this evening's program online. I'd like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and CVS Health,
I'm Rachel
as well
Floor,
as the
Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation.
as well as the Mass Cultural Council and our media sponsor, the Boston Globe. We look forward to a question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. President Kennedy's time in office included many events with serious intelligence and national security ramifications. Tonight, we are in for a treat. We're going to take the leap from history to fiction, diving into the process of translating intelligence work and national security issues to the page and the small screen. I'm so pleased to extend a warm virtual welcome to the library to Matthew Quirk. He's the New York Times bestselling author of Inside Threat, Red Warning, Hour of the Assassin, The Night Agent, Dead Man Switch, Cold Barrel Zero, The Directive, and The 500. He's an Edgar nominee and the winner of the Thriller and Strand Critics Awards. His novels have been translated into 20 languages, and The Night Agent is now a television series on Netflix. I'm also delighted to welcome Pradeep Ramamurthy to the library virtually. He is currently a partner at New View Capital, a venture capital firm. Earlier in his career, he held leadership roles in national security, including advising two presidents as part of the White House National Security Council and serving as an FBI intelligence officer. It's also a pleasure to welcome Shawn Ryan virtually, an award-winning screenwriter and television producer. For his work creating and show running the crime show The Shield, he earned a Golden Globe, 2 AFI Awards, a Peabody Award, and an Emmy nomination for writing. His other television credits include The Unit, Lie to Me, Terriers, The Chicago Code, Last Resort, Mad Dogs, Timeless, SWAT, and of course, The Night Agent, which premiered on Netflix in March 2023 and became one of its top 5 most watched English language premieres of all time. And I'm also so glad to welcome our moderator for this evening, Mark Arsenault. He's a reporter at the Boston Globe, where for the past 4 years, he's worked on in-depth investigations, tackling issues such as incarceration and the regional housing crisis. He has covered many other topics for the Globe since 2010 and previously at other New England papers. He is also the author of 4 crime fiction novels and the nonfiction book, The Imposter's War, The Press, Propaganda, and the Newsman Who Battled for the Minds of America. Please join me in welcoming our special guests. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Rachel. Welcome, fellas. I'm looking forward to talking to y'all. I think it's going to be a lot of fun, and remind people watching that if you have questions, please put them in the chat, send them to us, and we will do our best to get to them. So I think we'll start with Matt. You're a thriller writer. I think that's an amazing occupation. How did you become one?
Well, I always had the writing bug, and in college I did it, and then I found out I was really bad at the sort of writing they have you do in college, which is that New Yorker kind of domestic realist fiction. And it was funny because I was like a 19-year-old kid, and I didn't have a lot of kind of deep life experience to tap on. And it just didn't fit. And I got a B minus, which is like really hard to get at Harvard. It's like a tough grade. And so I put it aside, and I was lucky enough to also be doing journalism through the school newspaper on the side. And then I landed a job at the Atlantic. And it was a really neat time to be working there. It was a run up to the Iraq War. I started there between my junior and senior year, and I suddenly had this kind of baptism by fire in politics and foreign affairs, because the owner of the magazine held these sort of old school salons where like the former CIA director would be there, and people debating whether the U.S. should be an imperial power again. And he lived in the former Cuban embassy. So all of that kind of fired up my imagination, and it got me back to the books I had sort of grown up loving to read, which was like Joseph Conrad and also John Grisham and Stephen King, just kind of more um, like genre stuff. And so I had always had kind of that writing habit. And then I sort of found the material for it. And, fast forward 8 years, I took forever to figure out how to write a book. And then I lost my job in the 2008 recession. It hit a lot of the journalism pretty hard. And then it's actually a great story. I got some encouragement. I had sent the book out just hoping to find out if I was any good at it. I didn't know. And then 3 days after I learned I got my notice, I heard back from a friend of a friend. I'd given it to a young journalist to give to a young agent, thinking this is a not intimidating way to get into things. And then right after I got my notice, he wrote back and he said, this is great. You should keep going. And that's not coming from me. That's coming from my boss, who's John Grisham's agent. I was like, oh my God. So I really, that gave me the confidence to go for it. And then, it's a roller coaster and ups and downs, but that's kind of how I got into the throw of writing. I was pushed out of the nest a little bit. And then, the DC experience, I met folks like Pradeep, and Pradeep's cool overnight job when he was at the FBI. Stuff like that, I all filed away. And many years later, I had that in my notes and was casting around for an idea and said, oh, this could be a wonderful setup for a book.
So that's your origin story. So tell us then the origin story of the Night Agent.
Well, the Night Agent was inspired a lot by Pradeep, who we were friends in DC. And then I'll probably tell a kind of romanticized version of this. And Pradeep is a very low-key, humble guy, so he'll probably, tone it down a little bit or something. I like to really, that's why I'm writing fiction. I like to really dramatize things. But he worked a night shift, and I knew he worked for the FBI, and that was about it. We weren't super close then, but I just thought, oh man, this young guy, he's at a party, and then at 10 o'clock he disappears every night. And that's kind of all I knew. And I just imagined him sitting by a phone that never rings. And when I put that in my notes, and then I don't know, 10 years later, I was going through for my next book idea. And I was actually trying to kind of like level up a little bit. I was getting a new agent, a new publisher. So I wanted to, and writing a book on spec. So I wanted like a really kind of blockbuster book. And in small world news, I was talking to a friend of mine who's a really good friend of Shawn Ryan's, who's a novelist and screenwriter, Greg Hurwitz. And I mentioned that idea as the hook for a book. He said, that's terrific. So I kind of ran with that. And then I started looking into the real life world of watch officers who are at the White House and the Situation Room and different agencies. And, they stay up all night fielding crises and preparing materials for the most powerful people in the government. And there was a real life element where in the White House Situation Room, where the novel's set, you could have a relatively junior officer be the president's first point of contact, like if you have, the Cuban Missile Crisis or something, on a global, an unfolding global crisis. And because I'm always looking for dramatic moments, you could have this young person actually have to go wake the president. And night action, as I understood it, was a cable or crisis. I might be totally wrong on this. That required you to go wake up the principal. So that was kind of all the material that went into the book. And then I just had to. It's funny when you have a hook, then you have to make up the whole story. So, but that's where it came from.
So let me ask Shawn. So tell me, as a showrunner, what is that job? Can you define that job for people maybe not familiar with that?
Sure, you're just kind of basically responsible for what people end up watching. So I'm the head writer. I hire the writing staff that I work with to write the show. I hire the directors who are going to direct on the show. All of this is with approvals of Studio Network, so I don't want to make it seem like it's only me, but I'm putting out there who I want to be the actors in the show, the directors, the writers, the editorial team, and I work very collaboratively with a number of people, with me at the head of it, just trying to tell the best television story we can and try to, appeal to an audience.
So Sean, when you look for a book and you're thinking a book you may be considering a novel or maybe a piece of a nonfiction narrative that you might want to adapt for TV. So what do you look for? What are the elements that book needs to have?
Yeah, I actually haven't done a lot of book adaptations. I did one early in my career that was never made. Um, and so I can't say that I'm constantly looking for this. I will just say it was really kismet. The last meeting I had before COVID shut everything down and sent us all scrambling for our homes and our Zoom screens was a lunch with Jamie Vanderbilt, who's a writer and producer that I admire a lot. And right near the end of the lunch, he mentioned that they had the rights to this book called The Night Agent, and they were looking to see if anybody wanted to adapt it for TV. I'm usually really busy, but when COVID hit, I suddenly found myself with this free time, and I ordered the book on Amazon. What I'm looking for isn't like a full TV show that all I have to do is kind of take it from prose and put it into dialogue form. I'm looking for ideas that are meaningful to me, that provide a springboard to telling bigger stories, right? Because when you're on The Night Agent, we're filming our third season right now, and you're going to have to go beyond what's in the book to do that. So you're looking for characters that are really meaningful for situations. I certainly look for the hook. Matthew talked about the hook, and that was the first thing that got me. I just love the idea of the least important person working in the White House becoming a real important person in the grand scale thing. I think that plugs into a lot of like 70s conspiratorial, movies and TV shows that we all love. So I love the characters of Peter and Rose. I love the idea. The thing that really appealed to me, and I shared some of this with Matthew, and I sort of posted it because when season 2 premiered this year, it premiered on the 10th anniversary of my father's death. And what was really impactful to me was Matthew had written this character that really he just wanted to know the truth about his father. Was he a traitor? Was he not? And there were certain mysteries that came about upon my father's death of things that I really wish I could find out. And I felt that was just very universal. So there's nothing generically that I look for book adaptations. I haven't done many of them, but there was so much of what Matthew had written in this wonderful book that appealed to me, and I saw that could give me a great basis for a TV show while also leaving open things that I wanted to bring to it.
Right, right. Pradeep, can you talk about what your job was in the government? What did you have to do back in the time the period that you knew Matt and where he was amazed that you would leave parties every night at 10. Apparently you were out at parties every night, apparently. But what was your job?
Yeah. So I've learned a bunch of interesting things just in this last like 5 minutes. The first of which is that, Matt basically thought I was the least important person at whatever institution I was
I
working
think
at.
Sean said
That's
that.
how I put it. That's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
how
yeah.
Matthew ever put it.
Yeah.
So, as a 20-something running around DC, anyone that's been to DC knows that the 20-somethings are the ones that think they have the most important jobs in government. But yeah, so at the time that I knew Matt, initially, I joined the FBI. I very much like my 20s were the shadow of 9/11. I lived in DC. I went to college in DC. I actually interned at the Pentagon the summer of 2011. Worked on the side of the Pentagon that one of the airplanes hit, and I had just finished that internship in August and was on the campus at Georgetown when 9/11 happened. And I was already pretty interested in public service, pretty interested in national security, international affairs, but that kind of changed my perspective, and I probably spent the next decade of my life in some way or another informed by what happened and, what happened because of what happened. And so initially I was a counterterrorism intelligence officer. So you're just kind of looking at threats to the homeland, which was kind of my focus. And then in the job that Matt is referring to, I was a daily intelligence briefer. So there's different agencies, and then a group of people across agencies basically spend the night preparing to brief their principals on which are basically the national security cabinet, if I can put it that way, on kind of a combination of what happened in the last 24 hours that's worth them knowing. But I think the more important part of the job in many ways is situating those data points in like a longer term narrative, which is kind of an analytical view of what's going on, right? So I've often kind of described this as, if you've ever looked at The Economist, there's like a couple pages on, politics this week, finance this week, except, you show up to work and there's basically an abridged version of that, which is what happened like the last 24 hours. And then the back half of The Economist and The Economist is an opinion magazine, right? Like, it says that it is. And the back half of The Economist is basically views that they've formed sometimes over a week, sometimes over years on, what are the most important issues going on in the world. And so you're just doing that, on a daily basis. And it was a super interesting job. I mean, I think, but it was nowhere near what Matt imagined happening. But
Well,
that was kind of that was the role. And because you typically are seeing your principal, your client, at like 7 a.m. or whenever, they can choose to take the briefing whenever. It just so happened that my principals were morning people, more morning people than I was, candidly, and they wanted. I was typically the second person they saw after their secretary, and you had to go to work like many hours before to prepare, right? And so I would typically go in around 1 or 2 a.m. and my day would kind of end around 12.
So Pradeep, as a young guy, how much like discretion do you have to determine how that briefing turns out? Like how much of that is actually on you?
I don't think so. It's a tough question to answer, right? Because it's not like I'm picking what gets shared at some level. The entire intelligence community is working, all day, all night to figure that out. I think a lot depends on what your job is to. I've always liked these jobs. I think throughout my career, I've had some version of this job where you're kind of a translator between a group of real experts, and people that need to know the top line and know that if they need to double click or triple click on that, they're not going to double or triple click on that with me. They're going to end up but surfacing what they need to kind of know to get that day going and what they need to double click on that day. So it's a lot less about discretion and a lot more about communication, right? Do you have a style that resonates with the people that you're communicating with? I mean, I'll give you an example, because my attitude towards any new job is read as much as I can and about people who've done this before, and there's this kind of famous story, which I don't know if it's true, that the PDB briefing really started with Kennedy. And when Kennedy was assassinated, LBJ started getting the briefing. And they just rumor goes that the agency just showed up. They were like, they weren't sure whether these briefings are going to continue or not, but they just showed up and started giving briefings because they obviously wanted the access and they also thought it was a good thing to do. But Kennedy apparently was a serious reader. And so he would spend a lot of time reading. And the briefer would basically call out key points here and there. And for apparently months, they just treated LBJ the same way, except, and again, I don't know how much of this is true, but LBJ apparently was not a reader. He was more of a conversationalist, liked to listen, liked to hear, liked to debate. And it took like 6 months for LBJ or someone to tell the agency that, hey, you know what, like rather than expecting them to read like a mini book every morning, you should actually summarize what's there, and then he can kind of figure out where he wants to dive in. So I think figuring out communication styles and who's a reader, who's a listener, when anticipating questions that are going to get asked. it was a really good education in also communicating with different audiences. So in some ways, I'm pretty thankful I had that job early on. Most people kind of have it mid-career. And so it has certainly shaped how I like think about the world ever since.
Oh, that's amazing. And you actually describing your own job seems like you could inspire yet another book just in that little description that you just gave. Matt,
Pretty boring,
what do
pretty
you?
boring book, but yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I had a question because I years later I was like Pradeep sheepishly like I kind of wrote a book about you. This is an awkward conversation. And but I kind of made it all up. And then it was really fascinating to talk to Pradeep later and to find out that it was what his job was, and that to me it was incredibly cool preparing that. Can I mention the document? I think you mentioned it.
Well, it's a range, right? There's not,
Oh, okay.
I mean, I think it's kind of colloquial, like my client was not the president. And so, but I think most of the senior cabinet has some version of this, and there's someone doing this, in the same way that most of the kind of security agencies have, like Matt rightly pointed out, like a watch desk, right? That's monitoring everything.
Can I mention who the client was, just generally the title? Is that
Sure. I mean, yeah, I don't
okay?
think.
Well,
Yeah.
I just because I had written this thing and I was like, oh, could you imagine a 25-year-old, coming face to face with these really important people? And then years later, Pradeep's like, yeah, I would every morning I would take this document from where all the secret intelligence comes from and drive it over and be the second person that the FBI director would talk to start his day. And I was like, wow. I mean, I just thought that was incredibly cool. And I'm curious, like, I guess coming from counterterrorism, you'd done a lot of briefings, but because I'm always interested in texture and scenes, and what was it like, your first day doing that, getting to wherever you were going to do this, to prepare the intelligence, at some ungodly hour, and then being up all night, and then seeing the FBI director in the morning.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure everyone has some version of this, right? Like the first time that they were in a situation that they never thought they would be in and were anxious. Um, and interestingly, I mean, I think there is this balance between kind of over preparation and being organic. Um, and so, I remember, I think, that first time I was like very prepared, very scripted. And then I think I got the name of someone wrong, right? And someone in the meeting corrected me afterwards, but did it in a nice way. I mean, I was lucky in that I also had pretty good mentors along the way. But yeah, I mean, you definitely have this feeling that, I mean, I actually initially said no to this job. I mean, I don't know if you and I have talked about this. I thought it was a job that you could only kind of be remembered for messing up. And so, and I've had a couple jobs like that, I feel like. And so I definitely spent a lot of time preparing. And I mean, again, like I think you're also not sure how the dynamic is going to be. And I'm, I suspect, Shawn's got a version of this in the sense of like dynamic between different actors and what, like, it can really make or break us, something. You're also trying to figure it out along the way. But I just remember being really focused on demonstrating a couple of things. One was that I kind of knew what I knew, but I think equally important was being able to say, I don't know. And I'll go figure it out. I'll go find out. I'll figure out who you should talk to get the answer, but I actually don't know. And I actually think that the first couple of times I said that was really what made my relationship with, in that case, the FBI director, et cetera, that I didn't try and make it up on the fly.
Great. Thanks, Deep. That's Shawn, can I ask you the steps required to create a TV show? Can you talk about like who has to say yes, what has to happen for like in the case of the night agent?
It's a very difficult process, and I've developed a lot of shows, many of which haven't been made, and the answer is that a lot of people have to say yes. I've always described it as, imagine that you're a medieval painter, and you have all these ideas in your head that you just want to put on canvas, but there are 5 or 6 families in Italy that own all the canvas and paints in the world, and they'll allow you to use some, but you've got to tell them exactly what you're going to do and why it's going to be amazing and why people are going to love these paintings, and then they've got to get sign off from other family members. It's, first of all, you have to convince yourself, like, oh, I think this is a show. Not only is this a show, but in success, this is something I would be passionate about working on for a number of years. And then in my case, I had to go to my studio, my home studio at that time, Sony, and convince them that, hey, they should put forward, some money to, to pay Mr. Quirk and company, to handle the rights, that they have to convince an author like Matthew that his beloved book is in good hands. And then you go out to a number of, networks and streamers and say, hey, we have this show and I have to pitch, what my vision of it is. And a lot of times the people you're pitching to don't have the green light authority. They will sort of upsell to their bosses, and then the bosses will want to hear a pitch, and then they might be interested, but then they have to go to the people that handle the finances for the company, and they have to run models about, okay, it will cost this much amount of money to make this show, and we expect to get this kind of return. And it's kind of a mini miracle when the answer comes back yes. And you try not to take it too personally when they delay or they say no, but it's your heart's really wrapped up in this work, and you hope you get the chance to present it to the public.
Right, great. And I'll remind the audience, if there's questions, get them to us and we will try to get to them.
Mark, can I
Yeah,
just
absolutely.
add a little? It was fun from my perspective because my first book, I was really fortunate to get optioned, and then that didn't go anywhere. And so I learned to not get my hopes up and to understand how many hurdles there are. So when they said, well, Shawn Ryan is involved, I was like, oh my goodness, this is incredible. He's one of my writing heroes. But we'll see. And then when they said it was happening, I had been through it so many times, I was like, I'm not going to get my hopes up too much. And then we didn't, Shawn was really gracious to let me read the pilot and ask for my opinion. It's been an amazing experience all around. But I still was like nervous it wouldn't happen. Sometimes things fall apart. And then just on Canadian Twitter, somebody showed that they had shut down a bridge and people were driving the wrong way through traffic, shooting blanks at each other because the night agent was shooting. And I was like, oh, okay, this is really happening.
Great. So what was it like, Matt, to see, dialogue that you wrote come out of these actors' mouths?
Oh, it was incredible. It was like the thrill of my life. And I was in Shawn's production office in his office in Sherman Oaks in a conference room, watching kind of a screening. So I was trying to keep it cool, but I was also like, and it's exciting stuff. So I was trying not to yell at the screen too much, because people were working outside. But yeah, it was like the thrill of a lifetime. And I don't know, because I grew up watching TV and movies, and I've kind of been through this because I've been involved in journalism. So, I'm sure you know about this. Like the first time you hand something in, they print it and give it to 1 million or 8 million people. You're like, oh my God, I'm inside or on the other side of this. And then the first time you see that with a book, you get that feeling again. And then the first time you see something translated to screen, it's the same way. And it worked out really well because, because Shawn and his team did such a great job with the material, but we're also like really nice and respectful about everything. And also Shawn had, as I understand it, some ideas of his own and sort of combined the two stories. So I got to see the opening scenes of The Night Agent, which are, maybe I'm straining too much to tie things together, but it's kind of what I imagined Pradeep's job was when I was 25, that's sitting by the phone. And then so to have that rattling around in your head for 10, 17 or 10, 15 years, whatever it was, and then to see it on the screen was incredible. And also to see kind of like almost direct translation was incredible. But then the really fun thing about the show is Shawn then took the story in a very different direction. So I got that thrill, but I also got to come at it as a viewer. And even by the end of the first episode, I was, grabbing my pillow because the twists started piling up. And yeah, it's been a really wild experience to see characters that I kind of came up with in the garage take on a life of their own because the second season is brand new. So it's really been a thrill on a lot of different levels.
So let me ask you this. So when you're writing a book, I think every author has had this experience. There's some point in every book where you think, this is not going to work. Ripped myself up a tree. I don't know where to go. What was that point in The Night Agent where you may have lost confidence in the story?
Well, it was less about, I mean, yeah, we call it a loss of confidence. And it's wild that I don't know if this happens in TV productions too, because that has even more money and people involved. But at one point in every book, you're like, oh, this isn't going to work. I've wasted a year of my life. I'm going to go hide under a pillow or something. So with The Night Agent, I was writing it. The book has a bit more a bit more real world connections to politics and foreign affairs. Like the bad guys are Russian in the book. And there's a question. I'll do this without spoiling anything, but there were things in the news in the run up to the 2016 election that were very under the radar when I started writing the book. And so that was kind of the plot. And then by the time I was finishing the book, they were like front page headlines every day. And at that point, the book went from being like, oh, I've taken some cool things from Ukraine and sort of woven them into fiction. It went from that to being like, oh, this is sort of partisan chasing the headlines. If I had followed my original outline, and I outlined. So I said, I'm doomed. This isn't going to work. What am I going to do? And it's not an enjoyable way to do things, but it forced me to add an extra twist, which is in the book and the show, I believe. And it actually, I think, made a much stronger book. It made it less, it made it hard to read in any partisan way. And, if you surprise yourself with a twist late in the writing process, it's definitely going to surprise the reader. So it worked out for the best, although it was a bit harrowing as it went. Sorry to be a little vague. I don't want to spoil the book too
I
much.
understand you want to spoil the book.
Because the book's very different. You can watch the show and the book, and they have different twists. So that's another fun aspect to it.
Yeah.
One thing that's interesting to me hearing this is regularly my wife and I will mention Matt in the context of resilience, right? Because I think both what Shawn and Matt are describing is just kind of incredible, because I think this whole artistic journey requires way more resilience than I think people really understand, right? And so I remember, for example, when Matt wrote his first book, and the agent showed up, and basically I think, and I summarize this to people as the agent showed up and was the only agent to really reply. Matt, I remember being really excited that this agent was going to spend time with him in DC, and Matt is separately an incredibly funny human being. The way I remember him telling the story is, and then the agent told me that this book was going nowhere, and basically said, you've got a lot of talent, but guess what? We're going to just take this book, put it in the trash can, and you're going to write a whole new book with, under our kind of like mentorship and guidance. And, Matt had like quit his job at the time. I mean, he had like gone all into this. And I actually remember I remember the exact moment when like that second book, which was the 500, kind of made it, which was I was in India, and I had at the time Google alerts were a thing. I don't even know if they're still a thing, but I had Google alerts on Matt and the book and whatever. And I just remember seeing a headline come across that was like Fox Searchlight options Matt Quirk's first book, and it was just incredible to see that journey. And I don't know that a lot of people, myself included, would have the resilience to have someone say, "Hey, here's this thing that you spent the last year working on. It's not actually good, but there's a glimmer." And I just think that whole process of kind of the creative journey that both Shawn and Matt are describing in different ways, to me, is always like a really good example of resilience that I think very few people see, because what they end up seeing is like the finished product.
And I've sort of, I have actor friends, not to generalize about actors, but they're like, I got rejected for 97 things last week, but this next one's going to go great. And I've always been amazed by like their hope. Um, and I'm not really cut out as like a total devil may care artistic temperament. I just kind of like writing, and it was almost good I was pushed out of the nest at the Atlantic to do it. So it's been a process of kind of like digging deep for that resilience, because my first book was this very I mean, if you'll indulge me, like, because it's kind of a fun story, I'd give myself some time to live off of meager savings and write the books. And then I got engaged to my wonderful wife, now wife Heather. And I was like, this is the deadline. I'm not going to be at the wedding saying, "Oh, don't worry. Don't worry. I'm working on a novel. It's all going to work out." And then, the book where I got the vote of confidence, that got shut down, but I got an agent and I wrote another book. And I was living like extremely cheaply in DC. And then a month before the wedding, yeah, we sold the book, and I had just hoped to have enough to write another book. And it sold for this, like, in a really big deal. And then the movie rights happened the next week, and I was getting these calls while I was riding the bus with a broken leg. So, the story of how this stuff happens is almost as thrilling as the stories themselves. And the Night Agent coming together, that had been around Hollywood and had a lot of interest, but didn't actually get picked up. Maybe in a very small scale, but we said, this is a special thing. Let's just hold it and wait for the right thing to happen. And then it was like a year or two later, and it was Jamie Vanderbilt liked the story, and then Shawn, and it was The Little Engine That Could, and then it happened. So it's a roller coaster.
Let me ask you a nerdy writing question, if you don't mind. So, like you said, the book, the bad guys are the Russians in the book, right? So this is really a modern Cold War thriller. And how do you think about the concept of good and evil in a Cold War thriller like this? That do the bad guys know that they're bad guys, or is that just a function of what side you're on?
Well, I mean, this is almost like an axiom you tell younger writers, but your bad guy has to.
Think he's the protagonist of his story. And then honestly, I'm a little rusty on the Night Agent, but he's doing the right thing. And then what was really enjoyable, what I like to do, which is a little messed up because I like to put the characters through the darkest possible thing, the crucible you can put them through, but you have this father and son thing that Shawn mentioned. So, what if someone's father was a traitor, or his whole life has been marked by the fear that his father's a traitor, and then I have to have him kind of act like a traitor to answer to what he thinks is the higher good. So it was, a lot of fun. Fun's not the right word. It was really satisfying in terms of crafting the book to get to take him through that journey. And it came out of like real world stuff where most spies I met in DC are really boring. And this is something I say all the time, and Pradeep has a lot more experience. So is this true? Like they're super square, a lot of Mormons, and they're sort of selected because you don't want, like, James Bond would never make it because he's an alcoholic gambler and just has too much exposure to compromise. Is that kind of?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, and this goes to a question that I always think is interesting, which is, in the years that I've known Matt, there are like details that he's obsessed about, right? Like getting right. And then obviously at the macro level, like it's complete fiction. And so What I would say is like in general, one of the things that writers in Hollywood have collapsed into one is a spy is both an analyst and an operator. In some shows and movies, you kind of see the delta. I think you do see it in The Night Agent at times. But I think also, that first of all, there's a big personality difference between, analysts and operators. And then I think the other is, I wouldn't know enough. I mean, the entire demographic of the modern intelligence community is so different from the intelligence community that was kind of storified in the Cold War, right? Like the Cold War was this long, drawn out, strategic, kind of contest between two superpowers playing out around the world. And meanwhile, the most kind of seminal, I think, national security event for most people in the modern intelligence community was 9/11. In many ways, what was like a dogfight in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? And it's just very different, I think, demographically. Both, and now in some ways we're like back in this. Not that the terrorism threat is gone entirely, but we're back in this, I think, a lot more complicated contest between multiple powers that, it's just a different animal. So I don't know. I mean, certainly in the analyst side of things, I've met a lot of people that, are very bookwormy, and then I've met operators that look exactly like the characters you see on television. So I think it's kind of all over the place.
I mean, I raised that because it was just one of these kind of real life things. And I was like, oh, I can get that in as a grain of truth. And it'll be interesting to start with a character. And it's a bit more pronounced in the book where he's super straight-laced because he's so scared of kind of falling in his dad's path. And then by the end, he's gone completely ape. And it's just fun to take a character on that journey. And I was curious, or maybe we can cue this up for questions, but when you're watching shows like this, Pradeep, are you there with the
Oh yeah.
suspension of disbelief
Sarah,
and whatever
my
goes?
wife hates this because I'm just like, oh yeah. I mean, like within the first, like, I remember 3 minutes of watching The Diplomat, I was like, it's insane. This idea that every ambassador has their own private airplane. Like, what is this? And I'll just like start down that road, and usually what happens is Sarah will just leave. Um, but yeah, it is kind of hard to watch. On the other hand, and I mentioned this to Mark, like I think that some of the ways in which our capabilities are projected on Hollywood are actually quite useful as a national security asset, right? Uh, because I think some of those capabilities are probably underplayed and others are overplayed. And both can actually be valuable to us, right? In terms of how we're seen overseas.
Shawn, the show was a hit. I mean, that's obviously what you're looking for. It's hard to know if everyone knew what made a hit, then everything would be a hit, right? But what do you think of the elements about the show that made it popular and has sort of spawned the next two seasons?
Sure. I think some things that are in the book. I think Peter as an underdog is really appealing. When I said least important person, he's the person with the least power, in the White House, right? And the idea that, and I think we all can feel powerless sometimes in our lives, and the idea that you can sort of overcome that to become, the hero of a story, is important. I think the relationship between Peter and Rose, um, was something that was really meaningful to our audience. Um, because one of my criticisms of I'd never done anything in this genre before, and I always felt that the genre hadn't been done well on TV. It had been done really well in movies, I thought, over the years. Um, and one of my favorite movies is 3 Days of the Condor. Um, but the romance at the center of 3 Days of the Condor between the male and the female leads is kind of ridiculous in that movie. He kidnaps her, holds her, and then they kind of have sex together. It's kind of bizarre because they only had 2 hours to do that. So in this show, I think one of the things that was popular is we could really build out the Peter Rose relationship, much like Matthew was able to do in the book. I would say that there's definitely people who like the action. The stunts, our actor, Gabriel Basso is perhaps the best actor I've ever worked with when it comes to doing his own stunts. He's really authentic in the fights and, you know, and the action stuff. But you're right. You can never know what's going to be successful. You can try to increase the odds with certain casting or certain, big name IP, the various things. But the reality is the audience doesn't know what they want until they see it. And you don't know whether the audience is going to want what you're giving them until they see it. It's difficult like that.
Right. Well, why don't we hit a couple questions that have come in from the audience, right? So I think this is for Matt, because there's one Night Agent book and there's 2 seasons. Like, did you enjoy the season 2 take on the characters that you had created?
Yeah, and I felt a little bad because when you do a standalone, um, you can do certain things that you wouldn't do if you're setting up a series. And I sort of learned this the hard way. My first book was a standalone. They said, "This is so great. Why don't you turn it into a series?" And there were a lot of challenges there. And that actually happened with my third to fourth book, because in the book, I have Peter and Rose sort of ride off into the sunset and say, like, to hell with DC, and happily ever after. And then it was fascinating to see what Shawn and the team of writers did with it, and I thought they did a really great job. And it was just fun. If I can just like do a fun anecdote, because I got to go to New York to watch them shoot some of the second season, and I had no idea if Rose would be back. And Shawn and I had talked about it early on, and it was kind of an open question. And I was just hanging out on the soundstage, and then I saw Luciani come out in this shimmering green gown. So it was like a great intro to, hey, like, Rose is back, and I didn't know if I'd see her again. And yeah, I think they did a great job, and also building it up for a series and really leaning into that kind of tech competence to have her be an essential part of the team. So, and also just at another level, it's really fun to watch the story go on.
I appreciate Matt's comments. I will say that it was harder to come up with a story in season 2 without having the blueprint that we
Oh, of
had in
course, yeah.
season 1. It's a different challenge because when you have the blueprint, you you want to be respectful towards it. And so some of the hard stuff we had to do was like, well, how do we preserve this or that from the book, or how do we, make sure that we sort of honor this? And then in season 2, you're just sort of flying blind, and you miss having the things that you could debate about whether we keep this or not. There was nothing to keep, at that point, and so yeah, it made me really appreciate the blueprint that the book was for us in season 1.
But
Well,
when
that
I
kind of, yeah, go ahead, Matt.
but when I heard Shawn was going to be involved, I was so excited because I if somebody had said, "Hey, this book's a huge hit, turn it into a series," I would have like wailed at the thought of it because, you know, keeping something going and just building it off of the character dynamics is a really challenging thing. So to hear that Shawn, um, who I'm a big fan of, was going to do it was amazing. Because if I would go back and watch The Shield, and I would just see how he had, set up almost like a chessboard, like these characters, and that creates sort of and that's the engine of the story. It's not like, oh, this hook. I mean, that's there, but really it's the characters, and to know that somebody was going to be working on this who can sustain a show for. I forgot to congratulate Shawn at the top because I mean, SWAT just wrapped after 8 seasons. He can keep these shows going forever. I was really excited to have somebody who knew that craft, and I mean teaches that craft to other people working on this story. It's been really incredible.
Yep, that kind of maybe gets into this next question. Shawn, when adapting for the screen, so what's the process for deciding what to keep from the book what to leave out, and maybe what to augment?
So here was my process. I read the book the way anyone would read a book. I realized I was interested in adapting it. So then I read the book a second time, and this time I read it with a pen. And as I read something that I feel like is important to what I want to write, or is a moment that I think deserves to, to be in the pilot episode, I underline it. When I'm done with that, I give the book to my assistant and I say, just type out and give me in a Microsoft Word document the text of everything I've underlined, right? And then I'll be honest, I don't know if I ever told Matthew this. Then I never went back to the book again. I never read the book again. I had the moments that I thought were there, but then I had to say, okay, the book is giving me all it can give me, I think, for what I need. And now I need to start thinking of this as a show, not thinking of it as, as a completely faithful adaptation of the book. The only time that I digressed from that was I was having a little trouble with the Rose character at one point, and I did call up Matthew, and I just said, when you were writing Rose, how did you think of her, and how did you unlock her? Because I'm having some trouble, and he gave me just a really interesting response that unlocked so much for me. He described Peter as being a rule follower and Rose as a rule breaker. And in order to survive everything they're after going through, each had to become a little bit more like the other. And those may not be his exact words, but that's what I turned the words into. And from that moment on, it just sort of came alive. So the adaptation was really, I did have an idea about Secret Service agents protecting the vice president's daughter. That was something that, I had come up with, because I didn't think there was enough in the book to sustain a whole season of television on its own. And also, you don't wear your characters out when you're writing a novel. You can have Peter be in every scene, but you do wear your actors out if you require them to be in every scene. So you want like doing storylines that you can cut away to and, do this stuff with. Um, so yeah, it was just a matter of, for instance, we opened the pilot episode um, on this metro train explosion. And if I recall right, that is something that's sort of mentioned as something that happened to him in the past in the book. It's not something that's like an active sort of thing. But I remember thinking, wow, that's a great moment. And that's such a great inciting incident, to be able to sort of tell about character. And then we had to find a way to connect it to the storyline later on. So you're taking things that you really love about the book, you're looking for possibilities to sort of add and augment along the way, and then occasionally you have to call the author to help you figure out how to write one of the characters.
Well, and there was an actually with the train scene. It's kind of fascinating, to me at least, because that was the opening scene of the book as drafted, and then what we realized is because Peter in the book, he starts really buttoned up. Um, so we needed to give a glimpse of him going ape later on. So we pulled that forward. And then, when you're done with the book, you could just move stuff around like like puzzle pieces or something. So I had shuffled things around and taken my train crash scene, which I love because it was just kind of like I grew up on the 70s and 80s movie. It was one of those great openings, and I put that in the middle. And then when I looked at the pilot, Shawn was very nice to share the pilot with me. I was like, "Oh, the train scene's back at the beginning," and it was just like, I love this guy. He sees right all the the lines of cleavage, and it was really neat.
That's great. So maybe build on something you guys were just talking about, something that Shawn said about who's in every scene. Now the book is written, this is another nerdy author question, right? So the book is written from sort of a multiple points of view, right? Usually, oftentimes we're in Peter's head, sometimes we're in Rose's, sometimes we're in the bad guy's head. Do you think, I mean, the effect of that is that the reader knows more than the characters do oftentimes, right? How much intention went into that? And do you think the book would have worked from another point of view, maybe as a first person from Peter's perspective?
Well, my first two books were first person. Um, and it's really fun because you can get a lot of voice. And I mean, the protagonist in those first two books, the 500 and the directive, it's just like a much cooler wish fulfillment version of me. So he sounds a lot like me and so on. But the suspense is really hard because you have to like, hear a pebble skitter down the roof and so on. And then for my third book, which was more about special operations stuff because I was down here in San Diego and got to know some of those folks. I switched, and it was like I had, gone from being an apprentice to a journeyman or something, and they gave me all the tools, and I could have somebody just, sipping tea in the cabin, and then I could show the bad guy sneaking up on them, and it just turbocharged the suspense. So I think for these kinds of novels, it's great in that way, and also a little bit like what Shawn was talking about. You can accelerate things quite a bit. You can just have somebody um, go to sleep in, cash cans, whatever, and then you cut to the other character and you wake up and they're on a train through Paris. So it helps you accelerate things too.
Shawn, could you talk about that? About the need to have, especially in a show like this, multiple points of view?
Yeah, I'm always jealous of authors. I always joke that I don't know enough adverbs to write a novel. So I'm always really jealous of people like Matthew who can do it so well. One of the things I'm jealous of with novel writers is that they can write about what is going on in people's heads, right? And for the most part, unless you're gonna, go to dream sequences or various things in TV, you've got to, you've got to convey it in different ways. And you're not in anyone's head, but what we'll talk about is the camera being in someone's eyes, right? That close up of your lead as they're sort of suffering in some moment or as they're thinking about how to get out of a situation. You don't know the exact words that they're thinking, but you understand the emotions that they're feeling. And so I would say that screenwriting or television writing is from a different perspective. It's not first person, it's a little bit third person, but there are moments that you can get a little feeling a little first person-y, I guess is the best way I can say. And the camera never lies, as they say. So it's really sort of picking those moments where your actor is conveying something to the audience that can fill in what would normally take Matthew Quirk a paragraph to write about, but that hopefully you can just get in that glimpse of a second.
Right.
I saw Shawn, it might have been something you posted, but it appealed to me because I have all these nerdy like book writing things that I watch out for. And I don't know if I'll do it justice, but you were talking about, I think, like if someone is reacting to somebody, like you have to show the reaction before the stimulus or something. It was like some sort of rule or
Well, I have
where
all sorts of editorial rules. What you're probably talking about is I believe in reactionary camera work and reactionary editing as opposed to anticipatory. I don't want people watching my shows feeling like the people making the show know exactly what's going to happen next. So if the camera starts moving before the character starts moving, to me that puts a subliminal thought in the audience's mind that, oh, this is all being staged. And the person operating the camera knows exactly what's going to happen. I insist on my camera operators letting a person move, and then the camera starts to follow, almost as if it's documentarian. You have to make the camera operators forget that this is take three and they know exactly what's going to happen. And same editorially, I like to have a person start to talk before I cut to that person. So the person says the first word or two, and then you cut to them, almost as if you've been drawn to them by what they're saying. Whereas when you cut to somebody and there's a little beat, and then they speak, then they start talking again subliminally. I believe the audience is like, oh, this is being manipulated, and I, the audience member, have been being manipulated. This is all in the weeds stuff that I spend far too much time thinking about.
it's
No, it's
fascinating.
fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. We are very up against it. So Shawn, can you talk about season 3? What can you share?
Uh, I love what we have. I've seen the first 6 episodes. We've been editing them. We are back in New York City, but we also take detours. We filmed a lot in Istanbul, Turkey, which I had never been to before this. We do some filming in DC. We have just wrapped filming 6 days of stuff in Mexico City. And we're gonna be finishing the season doing some filming in the Dominican Republic. So like we are all over the place. Peter's dealing with all the trauma that he's had to deal with in the first 2 seasons, and without giving away too much, I really love season 3.
Great. Thank you very much.
Great questions, Mark. Thank you so much for hosting this.
Yeah, you're welcome. No, we appreciate our audience, and we certainly appreciate the library for hosting this. And you guys are a great bunch of guys, and thanks for making this so easy.
Thank you. And Shawn and Pradeep for joining us, and for
Yeah, I need
the
to
big
get to
part you played
know
in the
Pradeep
story.
a little bit so I can come up with a new series.
Yeah, it's going to be a series about people reading books in the middle of the night.
We'll make it a little more exciting than that.
Thanks for
He's the
having us.
perfect spy. Just, oh, nothing's going on. Just boring old Pradeep.